There has to be the space where we get people to understand what we mean by the words we use. But it is also deeply understandable that some people are too tired from trying to survive to want to go there with everyone they have to converse with on a daily basis. That's not a thing you're going to want to do when the very fact of being who you are is a kind of thing that might get you killed.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Damien Williams. Damien is an assistant professor of philosophy and data science at the University of North Carolina. Damien joins me to discuss language, how it is that language creates our understanding of the world, the importance of the fact that that understanding is shared, and how that shared understanding then creates groups to which we identify. And this is all discussed through the frame of communication and information. Why is it that people understand each other less and less in an age in which there is more and more information? How is it that we have arrived at an era of anti-intellectualism at a time of crisis when we need our scientists more than ever? How is it that men like Trump can stand on stage and deliver speeches solely about themselves that have nothing to do with material reality, and yet people identify him as their savior and doing the best for them? And what happens when we all exist within these different realities that then brush up against each other? How threatening that feels, our response to a threat like that, and then what this means for political polarization. This is where the conversation gets to with Damien, the fact that polarization is simply not an adequate word for the state of the world today, a world in which people do not agree on definitions and become pathologically identified with linguistic tricks rather than trying to find the common ground upon which we all stand. Sadly, this conversation was cut short, and when you listen to it, you might hear that really it could have gone on for a long, long time, that Damien and I were starting to get into something really meaty. And so we discussed off camera very briefly, continuing this conversation as a Planet Critical roundtable with many people coming on to discuss how is it that we approach one another using language in a time when language has so often become meaningless? And what is it that we have to do in order to build bridges towards people that may, be considered our enemies, quite frankly? So if you're interested in that roundtable, please let me know by leaving a comment on the Substack. And I hope you enjoy this conversation. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter inspired by each episode delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who believe in Planet Critical and keep the project going every week. Damien, thank you very much for joining me on Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
My first question for you is, why is the world in crisis?
One of the main reasons that the world is in crisis is, I think, a fundamental lack of communication, mutual understanding, and in many ways that this is being currently exacerbated by the technological framework, including things like the rampant use of generative artificial intelligence without considering why we're using it or what we're using it for.
Interesting. But I mean, that's kind of new, isn't it? The space where information becomes distorted, or has misinformation and disinformation kind of been around for longer than the internet?
Oh, it's been a lot longer than the internet, but it's been amped up in a new way. So it's a little bit of both. The speed, the rate, the scale at which information can be distorted right now is higher and faster than it has ever been before. There is more technology available to us, more access available to us, and more tools of distortion available to us right now than we've ever had before. While many of the techniques and the outcomes look kind of the same, they're being done and being used in drastically different ways.
I love that, distorted information. I think that should be what we call it now, distorted information. That's excellent. Something that I think is so revealing in how you first answered that question, lack of communication and understanding, is that you could argue that there's never been more communication in the world, right? Like with every day, there is more and more content being generated and news being published and websites to visit. And yet, what you're saying suggests that something else has to happen for language to be communicated. It has to be received and it has to be understood. So could you speak into that a little bit for us?
No, that's exactly right. Communication is multimodal. It's at least two ways, right? Like it's not just one thing being put out into the world and then whatever happens with it happens with it. It's someone seeks to convey information or a state of mind or a way of being or a way of feeling, and then they shape that message, and then that message is taken in, hopefully by others, and it is interpreted in something approaching the way that the initial speaker intended it, right? Or the communicator intended it. Because without that second part, like you said, there's not actual communication happening. It's just content being thrown against a wall. It's just, potentially noise and not signal. It's the idea of chatter. But with communication, you're actually engaging with people. You're actually like thinking together. You're coming to a consensus understanding. You're coming to a commonality of understanding what you're talking about, what the other person is feeling, and what the world looks like and what it feels like.
That's the direction I want to go in with this. I want to go into, language as a world building tool, creating the world that we inhabit essentially. But just before that, let's take a little detour because I'm thinking about Trump and his time on stage at CPAC and how he just spoke for 75 minutes essentially about himself. And I'm really curious now, thinking about it in the frame of what you've just said, is, in the past that kind of would have been unforgivable or unseemly. It's totally, a failure of leadership. And yet there's something about in a world where so much of information has just become like content, as you said, that is thrown against the wall to see what sticks, that has like facilitated even more so in the past this capacity for authoritarian figures to no longer engage, but to just dictate.
Yeah. And that is, I think, both a function of many of the ways that communication and mass communication, we use those terms in the kind of advised sense, right? Like mass communication as an idea has shifted, has changed into ways of being a speaker speaking out into the world rather than someone taking ideas and working through them with an audience. And so as you get this kind of, you can look at reality TV as a model of how that works. You can see the ways in which celebrity culture kind of amplifies a lot of that. But you get this mode of people looking for what they think of as communication oftentimes, but is really just like the single point of some orienting principle. And the more that orienting principle kind of resonates with them, the more they think is
wait. Explain that. What do you mean a single point of an orienting principle?
Right. So you mentioned Trump, for instance, right? Donald Trump is one person. He is one way of filtering a lot of these ideas through the world. But he is the kind of focal point of a lot of these ideas as they currently exist in Western conservatism, Western right-wing culture, these ideas that otherwise would be at odds or would be disparate from each other coalesce in this kind of single figure who is able to say, through me, you will get these things that you want, right?
I see.
And so people are able to kind of project what it is that they want into that kind of central space. And so regardless of what he says, because it's usually all about him, he's still getting that kind of, it's not that he's communicating anything in particular. He's saying me, but they're hearing me.
Yeah, okay.
And so one of the neatest, and I don't mean that as keen, I don't mean that as good, I mean that as one of the most carefully encapsulated and oft repeated things that Trump does, is that he has a very careful way of modulating that grievance space and saying that when he is talking about himself, he is talking about the person he's talking to, of building that space into something that looks like communication. It looks like sharing, but it isn't. It's a way of getting other people to take on his experiences as their own without him having to take on anything of theirs in actuality.
That's so interesting because it totally speaks to his kind of economic model as well, which
Right.
is that he should give nothing. And essentially what he promised, white working class voters, he has then taken from them in order to give back to them in a sense. I was having this conversation recently looking at how in order, speaking to the kind of economic situation of white working class men, which is worse. And it Trump's offer of raising them up was not, we will improve the economic situation for you. It was, I'm going to further oppress women and minorities so that you can feel more powerful again.
Right.
So it is his capacity to take instead of give.
Yes.
Economically as well, and you're saying that that's kind of present in his communication model.
Absolutely.
As well.
Like that's the mechanism by which he gets people to believe in him, right? Those mechanisms of belief are about people looking at or listening to him and feeling that there's something truly there which represents them, even when it very clearly never actually plays out that way. Yeah. So the first thing that he does upon getting reelected is he announces that he's going to reinstate the multi-trillion-dollar tax cut framework for, multimillionaires and billionaires that affects the middle and lower classes in no positive way, right? In fact, everything that has been done and everything that is aimed to do to undercut social programs is about finding the money to make that tax cut viable, right? Yeah. And so, as you said, he actively takes from the very people he said he was going to help in order to enrich the person and persons that he actually wanted to help. And that's the person and persons like himself. And so that mode of framing is all about getting people to believe that even though there is nothing actually there that is about them, that it's all about them.
And this is what's so fascinating about this era of politics, is that even when the information is right there, and even actually when the results are tangible and material, and people in America are already worse off, or the majority of people, still it doesn't quite break through this kind of fog that Trump and his strategy team have created. So let's use that to get back onto the main path of this discussion. How is it that words have the power to undermine material reality?
Everything that we do in language is about trying to frame and understand the world that we live in, right? It's trying to capture a picture of what it is that we experience, and it's also about trying to affect that picture. trying to predict and shape that picture, right? So words have always been about changing material reality. Language has always been about trying to shape our experience of what is real. And so the linguistic framing of things doesn't just describe what is. It shapes our possibilities of what might be. It shapes our understanding of what could happen, what may be real. And the more that we do that, and the more words that we have, the more concepts we have, the more we open up levels of possibility for ourselves, different ways of seeing things and different things we could do into the future. And that can be very good. That can give us pathways to make real beneficial change for people in their lives. Because if we can't conceptualize it, if we can't clearly understand or even kind of understand what it is that we're working towards, how are we going to build it, right? We can go by trial and error and maybe we'll get there, but the more we have an idea as to what it is we want to see or what is possible for us to see, possible for us to do, to experience, the better a chance we have of actually bringing it into reality. And so when somebody uses language in this kind of more weaponized way, when they try to use reality to shift how people experience, or use language rather, to shift how people experience and understand the reality that they're a part of, that is a function of what language can do. It's a function of what the mechanisms of communication can be turned towards, right? And so if you disrupt those mechanisms, if you distort them, you can create something, again, that feels like communication, but is actually about manipulation. Something that is about, well, it's called disinformation or misinformation for a reason, right? It's not quite the same thing, but it uses the same channels. And sometimes it intentionally distorts, and sometimes it's just an accidental replication or repetition of distorted information that they've already received, not intending to deceive, but doing so anyway, because they believe it. And the more that happens, the more that sense of shared experience or consensus reality, the more that gets shaken, the more it gets harder to hold on to. And so it can get to the point where you start to feel like you're living in literally different worlds than some of the people you're seeing around you, experiencing things day to day.
And there are theorists who would argue you are living in different worlds. This is not just a feeling. This is, this is now your new reality, because Elaine Scarry, in her wonderful book, The Body in Pain, which I'm referencing a lot for my book, begins about the fact that language creates shared realities. This is where we use words to create a shared understanding of the world together, and it must be shared. It cannot just be alone. You cannot have a mutual relationship with your world with yourself to create a new world. It must be with other people. And so when people don't understand you, you become isolated, or you no longer exist in these realities.
Yes.
And she is so far from the only one to kind of write about this power of language. And it seems to be a really important element to add to the polarization debate, because it's not just about the fact that people think differently from one another and don't want to talk to one another. How can we talk to each other when we live in different worlds like this, when we don't have a shared vocabulary, let alone a shared understanding of what is real? And there are more and more and more fracturings of this great social web that holds us all together, to the point where it now feels we're kind of existing in a hall of mirrors most of the time. Please. I mean, if you want to come in, please.
No, I'm emphatically agreeing with you because that is exactly, you've already touched on exactly some of the points that I wanted to raise, is that we are in fact inhabiting different realities fundamentally, socially and subjectively. And the language that we use is, in fact, a drastically different set of definitions for the same or seemingly the same words, right? And so even when you think you're communicating with someone, you think you are in conversation with them, you're actually talking past each other.
Yeah.
Because you're not using and understanding the words to mean the same things. And if that's the case, as you say, how can we in fact have a meaningful communication, a generative, productive, intentional communication when the people we're talking to literally do not understand us?
Yeah.
When we hear our interlocutor different than they mean to be heard.
You know, it's so funny because when I think about the word interlocutor, what I feel about that word is this, the idea of interlocking, you know, two fingers kind of curling around one another and holding on to each other. And that speaks to, you know, the definition of the word. You are meant to use the words to hold on to one another and create a part of this, you know, a part of this web, this social fabric. And so to miss one another, to not be able to make that connection, to not be able to hold on to each other and stick to one another, it's really quite frightening. And I think that this adds to the emotional element of polarization today, although I do not think that that's an adequate enough word, that the more that we try to speak to one another and the more that we don't understand each other, the more frightening that is. It doesn't matter that there's, you know, there's your cohort. Like, I'm in a cohort of people who think pretty much the same as me, or, you know, only vaguely small differences. We have a pretty similar understanding about where we are, how we got here, where we're going, you know, all of the kind of data that makes that up. Right. But it doesn't matter how many people are in that cohort. Every time I speak to somebody else that not only doesn't share the same understanding, but like rejects science, for example, it's terrifying.
Absolutely.
And that only pushes us further into the extreme positions within which we find community, surely.
Yes. And that's one of the things that it's kind of, especially, I guess I'll go with problematic in this particular moment. It is a particular site of tension, because we are in a moment where people need their communities and the people who are around them more than ever. And they need the people with whom they can feel safe and in which they can feel protected. Simultaneously, if the very fact of making a community in which I feel safe is enough to drive someone further from my position, my stated need of, hey, I need to be able to feel safe, how then can we even begin to have a set communication? To put this in the kind of most immediate contextual terms, you know, you can look at what's happening with communities of LGBTQ, trans, and non-binary people in America and the UK in particular. You can look at the fights over quote unquote DEIA, right? And that I say quote unquote because that term is starting to very quickly become that empty cipher that they want it to be, a site of attack more than anything else meaningful. But diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility is what's, you know, on target there. And if those of us who need access, those of us who need affinity of space for people who share our identities, who understand our experience of the world more closely, simply say, hey, yeah, I'd like to be around more people who get what it is to live in the world like I do. And that in and of itself is enough for other people in the world to say, no, and not just no, but how dare you, and not just how dare you, but I'm going to take that from you. I'm going to make sure you don't have it. If the very existence or the need for feeling safe is perceived as a threat, if the very ask for the ability to live my life, for us, for anyone to live their lives, to literally exist as they exist is a threat, then how can we have a conversation around what it means to have a pluralistic society, a society where more than one type of person can experience and understand things? How does that lead us anywhere but a road to violent exclusion of many different types of people?
I can't believe that this is where I want to go with this, but I want to make this conversation sticky.
Yeah.
I don't want to make it uncomfortable, all right?
Okay.
Because I've had a couple of experiences recently, and also I listened to a podcast recently with British journalist Ash Sarkar, who was talking about her new book, Minority Rule. She's a sort of very famous left-wing commentator in the UK, young woman, and in the first chapter she takes aim at the left wing and goes, we fucked up with liberal identity politics. What did it achieve? It didn't actually achieve anything. And it took the meat of something that was really great and it made it about language and self, essentially. And it paved the way for this sort of right-wing weaponization of this very thing. And just to thread in, I was having an extremely heated conversation with two Canadians recently, men in their 50s, 60s. It went on for 8 hours, this debate.
Wow.
Oh yeah, we were at it till 1 o'clock in the morning. It was wild. And they said the most amazing thing that totally rattled me. Because essentially our politics were totally different. They were former lefties, which was really, really interesting. And, you know, we got onto Trump and like they were really, one of them in particular was like really pro-Trump, and I managed to kind of keep it together during that. But it was when we got around to climate change around 5 hours in, and that being sort of denied, that I sort of struggled to keep my cool.
Yeah.
But one thing they said that was so interesting was like, it was crazy. I was saying 99% of climate scientists are in agreement that, you know, climate change is anthropogenic. Yeah, and this was done by a literature review. You know, I can explain to you what that is, et cetera, et cetera. And essentially, they called science into question. And one of the reasons why they did was because of identity politics. They said, what does science mean if I am now told that a male is a woman and a female is a man, and what, you know, that's unscientific, and that is obviously to advance some kind of purpose. So why should I now believe anything that's coming out of the academy or science itself? And I was like, do you know what? That is fair enough. It's fair enough for somebody to feel that way, not to think that way, but to feel that way, in the sense of like something that I was sure was a certainty that also, when you cut down to it, like sex is a spectrum, but you know, there is a difference between sex and gender that has kind of been forgotten by a lot of liberal identity politics going forward. You know, the way that it gets characterized in mainstream news is as a form of propaganda to further kind of, you know, divide people. And so you end up with some, you know, people who haven't read the theory, don't know who Judith Butler is, have never probably spoken to a trans or non-binary person in their life, getting fed this information and going, well, that isn't correct in the way that I was told to understand science. So why should I understand why should I believe anything else that is scientific? And I was like, God, that's interesting.
So I've been thinking on this and writing on this idea for a while, because what's
brilliant,
what that is, that's what we call epistemic threats. And the epistemic threat is the threat to the way that we understand and the way that we know things. Right? And so when something arises as an epistemic threat, we have this moment where we go, okay, but that's not true. That's not knowledge. That's not facts. And when our understanding of the world is challenged like that, it can very quickly move into what we call an ontological shock if it is challenged for long enough, right? The ontological shock, it comes from, you know, ontology and philosophy is the study of what is real. And so the ontological shock is that moment where the thing that we thought was real for so long, the fundamental foundation of our world, is shaken. And when that kind of thing happens, it becomes easier for people oftentimes to discard the apparatus that shook the foundations than to discard the foundations themselves.
I completely agree with you. There's been a lot of interesting work around that with regards to, belief and identity and how, therefore, especially in a kind of increasingly, what's the word? Non-religious world, these other beliefs become our identity, and an attack on our beliefs is an attack on self.
Right.
However, I do think there's another point to tease out, which is that when the left, I think, sort of around the Western world, made language the sort of primary domain of politics and set about changing definitions without that being a conversation. Without that being a conversation with the white, it wasn't communication.
And that's the thing. That's exactly it. It's like, so it doesn't happen in the wider world. A lot of these conversations that were happened in academia, or they happened in the spaces of the groups in question. Right. And so we've talked a bit already about this idea of the ways that sometimes as a result of these kinds of feeling the increased polarization or dichotomy or hostility from groups who understand the world differently than you do, you kind of further coalesce into your own group, right? And so, for instance, if you take, you can see this in LGBTQ spaces throughout the 80s and 90s. And as LGBTQ spaces become more firmly of themselves, the conversations that are happening in that space are less and less conversant with the rest of the society around them. But there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
If the rest of the society around you thinks that you are wrong, bad, and wants to see you dead, it makes it hard for you to want to say, so here are these really intimate conversations my friends and I are having about the way we understand ourselves and our identity. Right? Like, that's not a thing you're going to want to do when the very fact of being who you are is a kind of thing that might get you killed, literally, depending on where you live, right? And you see the same thing happen in disability spaces. You see where, there's like a very fine set of nuanced distinctions between the ideas of disability rights, disability justice, disability access, disability activism. All of those things mean very fundamentally, foundationally different things within the disability community. And to the outside world who doesn't have any experience with that, it is all a gloss on the same stuff, right? And that's because it's hard enough for disabled people to get experiences, needs, anything about disabled lived experience taken seriously to begin with, without getting into the fine-grained weeds of, no, I'm not talking about just access. I'm talking about disability justice. And here's why that's different. There has to be a point at which we communicate with other people. There has to be the space where we get people to understand what we mean by the words we use. But it is also deeply understandable that some people are too tired from trying to survive to want to go there with everyone they have to converse with on a daily basis. Academia has problems of siloing itself out from the concerns of the real world in many ways. I've been in academia for a long time. I've seen it happen. I know that this happens. And simultaneously, there's this increasing weaponization of anti-elitism and anti-expertise that pushes people away from accepting what academia has to say ever. Now, again, a lot of that wouldn't be possible if academia had not siloed itself off and separated itself. from the concerns of a lot of the public, had not stopped making its work accessible to the public for a very long time. But it is also the case that many people within academia, researchers, theorists, trying to actually change how they go about that stuff, making their work open access, making the things that they have more available to everybody out in the world. It just so happens to unfortunately be happening at the exact point in time in which people have been conditioned, convinced, incentivized to regard anything that comes from academia, anything that comes from an expert, as inherently suspect.
Yeah. I think there needs to be a reckoning, though, with regards to accountability, responsibility, and also a seeking to build common worlds and finding common ground. And I think that those of us who don't want to see authoritarian figures in power, we're going to have to drop some of our perfectionism and our adherence to linguistics as the ultimate mode of politics, and seek to kind of, how do I put this? Seek to build bridges through compromise initially.
Yeah.
And I think that means for a lot of people having conversations that kind of like make distinctions again between like, okay, so this is what science is, and this is what humanities is, and this is like what subjectivity is, and this is what objectivity is. Because I mean, it drives me absolutely mad that we live in a world now where like objectivity, like scientific objectivity, is dismissed. And I do think that is a byproduct of kind of, you know, the 60s and 70s move towards postmodernism and then neoliberalism and all of that kind of stuff. You know, there needs to be a coming back to the central trunk and being like, right, okay, these are words that we can move past. These are words that we would like to bring in. We would like to join you. Hey, this definition is also for you. Please come and join us here, you know, because I don't think that's going to happen on the other side, because there's safety in numbers over there. Like there's the feeling of there being more numbers over there. So why would we, you know, cross and join a herd that also doesn't want us, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is something that Ash Sarkar was talking about in the context of the United Kingdom, which was like how the left behind the white working class. And she referenced in this conversation a graph that the Financial Times had put out that showed that when young people's happiness with the Democratic Party would go up when they were focusing on minority issues and go down when they were focusing on working class issues. And she was saying, what a fucking catastrophic failure of the left.
Yeah.
You know, that it goes down when focusing on working class issues. Like it should be going up for both, essentially. Right. So where is this commonality in which we can find each other?
And that's one of those things that there's a lot in what you just said that I think definitely needs unpacking, and some really serious, like, we need to spend some serious time looking at it and confronting it. But there's one of the things that I try to do. So I do a lot of work in data science, and I talk to undergrad students all the time, basically every day. That's my job. And one of the things that I talk about is the ways that demographics can get constructed, because all demographics are constructed.
Yeah, interesting.
Demography and categorization is nothing but constructed identity. But one of the things that happens is that there is a specific point at which the concerns of the working class become white identitarian concerns and categorized as such and leveraged as such more often than they are a working class collective concern. And so there's a point in the United States, especially, at which there is a political push to make the white working class think of themselves as white first and working class second.
Yeah.
And so that framing puts those things at odds. Now, those things don't have to be at odds. They don't have to remain at odds. But there is a history of why they are at odds. If you can make somebody blame a black or brown person, an immigrant, a woman for their problems when their problems are actually caused by their bosses and their bosses' bosses and the money markets that incentivize and leverage what their bosses and their bosses' bosses actually do in their daily lives. If you can push that blame away from its actual site of agency, from where it's actually happening, and push it onto somebody else, then you can keep that person satisfied with less. You can keep those people, that group, satisfied with less. And so there was a concerted effort, and there has been a concerted effort in multiple different identity groups to cause that kind of division, to say, well, you would have your rights if it weren't for X, Y, and Z group. You would have your ability to have a stable job if it weren't for these people over here.
Yeah.
And so that constant reframing becomes kind of this inherent wedge that gets used to keep that larger coalition from actually being able to remain coherent. But we've seen, even as recently as the late 20th century, we've seen groups push beyond that. You got groups like ADAPT, working on disabled issues in the United States. You got groups like ACT UP, who were working on, AIDS awareness. Those were multi-front coalitions of all kinds of different kinds of people. That's the kind of thing we have to replicate again.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, it probably starts within the left initially, because for all the talk of intersectionality, actually increasingly it seems like there are these fractured other realities. We haven't had time to get onto it, unfortunately, but you used this term before we started recording, bespoke realities.
Yeah.
There are even these bespoke realities on the left. And so the bridges need to be built within, first of all, so that there's also this feeling of safety in numbers.
Yes.
And that there's also this feeling of solidarity so that other people can kind of help do that work that is very difficult for an oppressed identity, i.e. speaking to the racist about why racism is bad, or speaking to the sexist about why sexism is bad. Like, I can do that for you as a white person, you could do that for me as a man, that would be great, right? Because it's going to be less emotionally difficult. But we need to do that so that then those bridges can then be built out. Because it seems so obvious today that, the problem here is not each other, right? The problem here is what's happening on top.
Yeah.
Damien, I'm so sorry, but we have run out of time. And I would love to continue this conversation because I feel like we've only just begun to scratch the surface. But unfortunately, I have to run this time. Maybe we can speak again later in the year if you'd be interested in continuing.
I would love that, because I also agree. I feel like we've started to dig down into some pretty important things, and I think there's a lot more that can be unpacked from them about exactly how we go about getting there.
Who would you like to platform?
Oh wow, there's so many people. So one of my favorite people to talk to about these kinds of things, Ashley Shue. She's my advisor, my PhD. There's people like Chris Gilliard, does really amazing work on surveillance and societies of being surveilled and locked into this kind of carceral weaponized culture. There's a lot of really good work on that. And gosh, so many other people. You're gonna have to give me a stopping point because I can
Well, let's stop there,
because
normally I say just one, but it's great that you've given two names because people can go and look up the two.
Yeah.
And I'd like to invite Ashley on, I think.
Yeah. She's fantastic.
Damien, thank you so much for your time today. I'm so sorry this ending was rushed.
Yeah, no, and I'm sorry about the beginning that caused it to be so rushed.
No, don't. Thank you so much for joining me.
It was great to get the chance to talk to you, and I really do hope we can, continue doing so.
Yeah, me too. If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.